Rachel Harper sat in the quiet of the garage, her fingers likely tracing the edges of the workbench. The Mustang was still half restored, and for the past few weeks, she had been coming here to find solace. Martin, her late husband, had loved that car more than anything. He had spent countless hours on it. His way of escaping the world, of dealing with the grief of losing his wife. Ethan's mother, Martin had loved deeply, and Rachel had admired that about him. But when he passed away unexpectedly, Rachel was left with a void, not just in her heart, but in the house that had once been filled with his laughter. And then there was Ethan, his son. Ethan was 20 years old, strong and brooding, with dark eyes that often seemed to look past her as if she were a stranger. Rachel had never been able to connect with him, despite her efforts to be a caring stepmother. He had never fully accepted her. His walls were high, and she respected them. Even though it hurt, the last few months had been particularly difficult. Ethan had gone off to college, and when he returned after Martin's death, it was like he was a ghost in the house, silent. Lost in his own world, it was a quiet, warm evening in early autumn when the unexpected happened. Rachel was bent over the Mustang, tightening a bolt that had come loose. It had been a way to keep busy, to hold on to the last thread of connection she had with Martin. Then she heard the door to the garage creak. Looking up, she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, staring at her. For a moment, they just looked at each other in silence. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was thinking maybe I should work on the car." Rachel was taken aback by his words. Ethan had always been indifferent to the Mustang. The thought of him wanting to work on it, on something so deeply connected to his father, touched her in ways she wasn't prepared for. Sure. She replied, her voice gentle. "I could use some help," as they worked together in the garage. The silence between them became less awkward. Ethan started talking about Martin, about the things they had never shared. He spoke about how much he resented his father for working so much, for not being there when Ethan needed him. But the resentment wasn't directed at Rachel. It was the grief of a son who had lost his father, a man who was trying to rebuild his world without the support of the person who had always been there. Rachel found herself sharing too, more than she had expected. She spoke of Martin's gentle ways, his care for the car, and how she had tried to understand that part of him. She admitted that she never truly understood Ethan's pain, and that had made her feel like an outsider. "I know it sounds crazy," Ethan said quietly as they cleaned up the tools, "but I think this car is the last thing my dad really cared about. I don't want to let it go. I need to finish it for him." Rachel's heart tightened in her chest. Ethan's vulnerability was a side of him she had never seen before. She wasn't sure if it was the grief or the need to feel connected to Martin, but she understood it. She felt it too. The need to preserve what was left of the life they had all shared. In the following weeks, Rachel and Ethan spent hours together in the garage. The work on the Mustang progressed, but so did their relationship. It started as simple exchanges, mostly about the car, but as the days passed, they found themselves talking more about life, about Martin, about dreams. Ethan had stopped retreating into silence, and Rachel had stopped holding herself back. from offering him the emotional support he so desperately needed. One late afternoon, the garage was filled with the sounds of tools clinking and the smell of fresh paint. Ethan had just finished sanding the last layer of the car's body, and he was wiping his brow, sweat streaking down his face. Rachel handed him a cold bottle of water, their fingers brushing lightly as he took it. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The world outside the garage felt distant, and all that mattered was the space they shared. The two of them alone in the quiet, working side by side. Ethan caught her eye and held her gaze for a moment. Longer than usual, his lips parted as if he was about to say something, but stopped as though unsure of what words could even begin to express what he felt. Rachel's pulse quickened. Was it just her, or was there something more happening between them? She couldn't put it into words, but the air between them was thick with something unspoken. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, his voice softer than it had ever been. "For helping me, for being here," Rachel nodded, unable to speak for a moment. His gratitude was more than she expected, and something about the way he looked at her made her heart ache. He wasn't just thanking her for the work on the car. He was thanking her for staying. "For not giving up on him, I'll always be here." Rachel said, her voice steady. She wasn't sure if she meant for the car or for him, but it felt true in that moment. As the weeks went by, the Mustang began to take shape. And so did the bond between Rachel and Ethan. Their relationship had transformed from a distant awkwardness into a fragile but real friendship, built on shared grief and mutual understanding. One evening, after a long day working on the car, Rachel was sitting on the hood of the Mustang taking a break. Ethan was beside her. Silent but present, there was an easy, comforting silence between them, one that had replaced the tension from earlier weeks. Rachel glanced at him, noticing the way the light from the garage cast shadows across his face, making him look older, more mature. She caught herself wondering what it would be like to be closer to him. Really close, but she quickly shook the thought away. "You know," Ethan said quietly, his voice breaking the silence, "I never realized how much I needed this. Working on the car. Being here with you, I think I'm finally starting to understand Dad. I didn't get it before, but now I get it." Rachel turned to face him, her heart catching in her chest. This was the moment, the one where everything between them seemed to change, where the emotional connection shifted into something deeper, something more without thinking. Her hand reached out, resting lightly on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it held so much comfort, warmth, understanding. And in that moment, their eyes locked again. And the world outside the garage seemed to fade away. "I understand," Rachel whispered, her voice almost a breath. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep, unspoken connection to Ethan. Not just as his stepmother, but as a woman who had spent years carrying her own loneliness. Ethan's eyes softened. His hands slowly reached up to touch hers, his thumb tracing the back of her hand gently. There was no need for words. Everything was understood in that small, intimate touch. Then, with a suddenness that surprised them both, Ethan leaned in his lips, brushing against Rachel's lips. Lingering there for a brief moment before pulling back. Neither of them spoke, neither of them needed to. The kiss, though brief, had ignited something neither of them had expected. There was a rush of emotions, of desires that had been buried under layers of grief and caution. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she felt a heat rise between them, something undeniable. He grabbed her tightly and moved his hands towards her chest. And they both forget their identity. The kiss changed everything. The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of longing and hesitation. They avoided talking about it. But the tension between them was palpable. Every touch, every glance felt charged. It wasn't just about the Mustang anymore. It was about the feelings. They couldn't deny the connection they had built and the unspoken bond that had grown stronger than they had ever expected. Late one evening after the Mustang was finished, paint gleaming, the engine running like a dream, Rachel and Ethan stood together in front of the car, the garage now filled with the quiet hum of the engine. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Rachel, about what happened?" He began, his voice unsteady. "I don't know what to say. I don't know if it's right. But Rachel placed a finger gently on his lips. Silencing him, she knew. She understood this wasn't something that could be easily explained. But they couldn't ignore it anymore. And in that moment, everything fell into place. They didn't need to say it out loud. They both knew that their bond had become something more. Something real. Let's just let it happen. Rachel whispered, her hand resting against his chest. And as they stood there together, watching the last rays of the evening sun cast a golden glow over the Mustang, a symbol of both their shared grief and newfound connection, Rachel and Ethan knew that this moment, this quiet, fragile moment, was just the beginning. They didn't need to explain the complexities of their feelings. It was as if the car, the garage, and the love they begun to rediscover were all woven together in a beautiful tapestry that neither of them could unravel. The Mustang was finished, its engine pairing with perfection. But the real work, what they had built together, was only just beginning. Rachel and Ethan's bond had evolved, taking on a new shape, but now they faced a choice: to embrace what had developed between them or push it away. Neither of them spoke of it, but it lingered, a heavy presence between them. The weeks following the completion of the car were filled with an unspoken tension. Every time they passed by one another in the house or the garage, there was an energy that crackled between them. Ethan's presence was magnetic. His deep eyes would linger on Rachel's face, filled with a mix of longing and something unspoken, and she would find herself drawn to him, caught between the woman she was and the stepmother she had always been. One evening after a long day of work, they sat together in the garage, the cool autumn air drifting in through the open door. The Mustang sat gleaming in the dim light, a reflection of their own transformation. Neither of them had talked about the kiss. Neither of them had brought it up since that night. But the unspoken words hung in the air, thick and full of possibility. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, breaking the silence between them, "about everything, about us, about Dad, about how much I regret not spending more time with him." Rachel looked at him, sensing the vulnerability in his voice, and reached for his hand instinctively. "You're not alone in that," she whispered. "I regret a lot of things too. But we're here now together, and we can't undo the past." Ethan turned toward her, his face softening as he looked at her. His hand shifted, cupping hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Rachel," he said, his voice low. "I can't help how I feel. I know it's complicated, I know it's not right, but I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath caught in her throat. His words were like a confession. And though Rachel had felt the same way for weeks, hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "I don't want to hurt you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want to ruin what we've built, the connection we found, but I feel it too." The silence between them grew heavy, charged with the weight of what they both knew. And yet neither of them could bring themselves to speak, the words that hovered just out of reach. Finally, it was Ethan who moved, his face closing the distance between them. He kept Rachel's face in his hands, his touch tender and careful. Without thinking, Rachel moved closer, the space between them shrinking with each step. Her fingers brushed against his arm as she reached for a tool beside him, the contact sending a jolt through her. She immediately pulled her hand back, but before she could take another step, Ethan turned, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence stretched thick with unspoken thoughts. His gaze was intense, filled with a question Rachel hadn't yet been brave enough to ask herself. The weight of it was unbearable. But as if drawn by some invisible force, Rachel found herself stepping closer once again. But this time there was no hesitation in the kiss. Her breath hitched as Ethan reached for her, his hand gently cupping her cheek, the touch tender but full of intent. Rachel's heart raced as she met his eyes, a silent question hanging in the air. Could she allow this? Should she pull away? She couldn't bring herself to move slowly. As if testing the waters, Ethan lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, hesitant kiss. Rachel's eyes fluttered shut at the first touch, the warmth of his lips sending a wave of heat through her body. She felt a rush of emotion, a whirlwind of everything they had been through, everything they had been trying not to feel. The kiss deepened, his lips more insistent. Now demanding, Rachel's hands found their way to his chest. Feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips, the rhythm matching her own, Ethan pulled her closer, his body pressing against hers as he kissed her more urgently. As if he couldn't get enough, Rachel's breath caught as she felt the heat of him, the hardness of his muscles beneath his shirt. She responded instinctively, her body moving closer to his, as if every fiber of her being was finally giving in. Her hand slid up his chest, threading through his hair, pulling him in deeper, if that was even possible. The kiss was everything: reckless, passionate, desperate. They had been dancing around this for weeks. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. The world outside the garage ceased to exist, and it was just them wrapped in each other's arms, in the heat of the kiss that neither of them wanted to pull away from. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, neither of them moved immediately. Rachel's hands were still on his chest, feeling the rapid beating of his heart matching her own. Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his breathing shallow, as if he, too, was struggling to process everything that had just happened. "I've wanted this," he whispered, his voice rough. His hand slid down her arms, holding her tightly as though afraid she might slip away. For so long, Rachel. Rachel swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, and yet for the first time in a long while, she didn't want to pull away. She closed her eyes, pressing her cheek against his, feeling the warmth of his skin. "Me too," she whispered back, the words coming out softer than she expected. Ethan's hands found her face again, his thumbs gently tracing the line of her jaw, before leaning in to kiss her once more. This time slower, more deliberate. Rachel melted into him, her body responding to his touch, her lips parting as she welcomed him in. Every kiss was deeper, more intense, as if they were both trying to make up for lost time, trying to bridge the gap between what they had been and what they were now. Rachel's hands moved lower, resting against his back, pulling him even closer. As their bodies aligned, the heat between them was overwhelming. Now, and as Ethan's hands slid down to her waist, she felt the weight of him, the way he fit against her, like they were made for this moment. But even in the midst of it all, a small voice inside her reminded her of the boundaries they had once respected. She pulled back slightly, her chest rising and falling with every breath. But Ethan didn't let go, his hands remained firmly on her, his gaze never leaving hers. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to know if they were both ready to take this step, to move past the quiet tension that had been growing between them. For so long, Ethan nodded, his hands gently caressing her face. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said quietly. "We've crossed a line, Rachel. But I don't regret it. I don't want to go back." Rachel's heart raced as she gazed into his eyes, knowing in that moment that nothing would ever be the same. The tension that had once existed between them had shifted, and what had begun as an uncertain connection had blossomed into something beautiful, undeniable and real as they kissed again. More deeply than before, it was clear that neither of them was turning back now. They had both given in to something that had been building for far too long. And in the quiet of the garage, with only the sound of their hearts beating in sync, they knew they had crossed a threshold that would define everything that came next. For a long moment, they stayed like that, wrapped in each other's embrace until finally they pulled back. Breathless and unsure of where they stood, neither of them knew what would happen next. But in that moment, it didn't matter. "I don't want to complicate things," Rachel said softly, her forehead resting against his. "I don't either," Ethan replied. "But we can't ignore what we feel. I don't know how it's all going to work. But I know this, I don't want to lose you." Rachel's heart swelled in her chest. She understood more than he could know how much those words meant. And though she didn't have all the answers, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't ready to let go of him either. The days that followed were a mixture of quiet, hesitant moments and passionate, unspoken understandings. Rachel and Ethan never spoke again about the kiss. But it was clear that everything had changed. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper, something that neither of them could name or fully understand. But they didn't need to. The emotional bond they shared was enough. It had become stronger than anything that had come before. They continued to work on the Mustang together. But the garage no longer felt like a place of grief. And unfinished dreams, it became a sanctuary. A place where they shared their hopes, their fears, their desires, and slowly, That unspoken love blossomed. One afternoon, weeks later, Rachel found herself standing in front of the Mustang again, staring at the gleaming car that they had both brought to life. It was a symbol not just of Martin's legacy, but of the love that had begun to form between her and Ethan. Ethan joined her, his presence steady beside her. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "We did it," he said softly, his voice full of admiration. Rachel smiled, her heart full. "We did," she agreed. And as they stood together watching the sun set over the horizon, Rachel knew that they had crossed a line, one that neither of them had ever imagined they would. But it was a line they had crossed together, and in that shared space they had found something beautiful. They had found love,